suppose, Eric?
Okay, so we've marched through most of the decision rule, but we're not finished. So we've discovered, we've taxed, we've dealt properly with the local, we've handled volatility. Volatility, the riding the tiger of these prices going up and down. And now we get to the problem I sketched that Chile's going to face when wireless electricity transmission comes in. That let's think of a few other reasons, examples of unsustainability. Most obvious is you run out of the stuff, you know. Cameroon has nearly run out of oil. A lot of the oil discoveries and gas discoveries of the last decade have been relatively small discoveries. They'll last for 20 years and that's the end of it. So sometimes the thing physically won't last longer than that. Other times it will become technologically obsolete. And in the case of oil, there's a real danger that regulation will tighten even before technology changes, because the world has already discovered more oil than it can safely burn. Okay? So we keep on discovering more oil, but the oil that we've already discovered cannot be safely burned. Okay? If we burn all the oil we've already discovered, the planet will get too. Right? So sometime over the next, 25 years or so, the world will probably put in place some sort of regulatory system that said not all this oil can be burned. You know, the big meeting in Paris in December, another round of trying to build global rules. And it's hard, but let's assume that as the world hots up and global warming becomes a reality that everybody's facing, we'll actually do something about it. And that will mean that some of the oil that's already discovered is going to have to stay in the ground forever. Right? Your oil? Once you get the sense that some of the oil is going to be regulated to stay in the ground forever, what's the sensible strategy? Get it out now, right? That's called the green paradox. But yeah, if everybody starts to do that, what happens to the price? Crashes, right? So once people start worrying, we go back. Even 5 years, people were worrying, oil demand's going to go up and up as China grows. And so the price will go up. Just imagine what happens if we get into a world where people are going to say, God, in another 20 years, 10 years, this oil's going to be worthless. Then the conclusion is, get it out now, but that action makes it pretty worthless even now, right? If everybody's scrambling. So there'll come a point, we don't know when people move from the psychology of we're going to run out of oil to the psychology of oil's going to become useless. Stranded assets, it's called, right? And at that point, the rents on oil really drop a lot. So there's a lot of reasons to think that these natural resource rents are not there forever. The longest possible limit,
is you physically run out.
and for some countries that's not that long, for some resources.
But the
There's a serious risk that it's actually becomes economically not very valuable well before it physically runs out. Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. Right? So what you do about that, you've got an unsustainable activity which is generating a lot of revenues at the moment, and you want to convert that into something that is sustainable. And it won't be by making that activity sustainable, it's inherently unsustainable. Right? So actually, if that's the problem, the very last thing you want to do is invest a lot in owning all the aspects that are dependent on that industry.
That industry's got to go.
So the basic elements we're going to go through are you're going to save revenues, not all of them, but a substantial amount of them. What are you going to do with those revenues? You're going to invest. And a lot of that investment will be domestic investment. And then you're going to build the capacity to do domestic investment well, which I call investing in investing. So that's the three steps to managing sustainability. Save, invest, invest in investing. So we're going to start by thinking about savings. And we'll keep it very simple, stylized. So this is time, and this is income. And here we discover our natural resource. And it lasts for, let's say, 20 years. And we get a revenue stream. We're going to keep it as absolutely simple as possible. So our revenue stream looks like that. Okay? So the resource lasts for 20 years, it produces a steady revenue stream and then stops. Right? We can't get a simpler structure than that. Right? But we don't want that to be the flow of our spending. We want to convert that unsustainable income into a sustainable pattern of spending. And essentially, we're going to do that by setting spending, I don't know, something like, say that. And the surplus of income over spending, we're going to save. To show what happens, I want to add another picture just up here. So it's saying time and now assets. So these are the assets we accumulate from saving. Right? I'll not say which assets yet, we'll come to that later. And basically, we're going to be building, at this stage, this is the year 20 when the oil's run out, or whatever it is. So up to that time, we'll basically be building assets. And then from then on, we'll keep our assets constant. This is a very simplified story that abstracts from everything else in the economy. But this is just how we're going to handle the revenues from this unsustainable natural resource. Right? So we're building up our assets generated from the natural resource, and then we keep our assets constant. Let's think what's happening to the income stream from our assets. Suppose we're able to invest our assets and get what sort of return should we give it? We've got to invest this domestically in the end. So let's suppose we can get, 10% return on domestic investment. So our income stream from, I'll do it in a dotted line, so that's our income from assets.
Just 10% of our assets.
Right, because we're getting a 10% return on our assets. Yeah? And if I've drawn it, my units are slightly different, but basically, this is my income from my assets here, and that has to cover my spending here, because this income is sustainable, unlike the natural resource income. This income is unsustainable. So what I've done by building up these assets is generate a sustainable income stream which enables me to spend long term. So during the first 20 years, I've actually got two sources of income coming in. I've got the unsustainable natural resource income and the sustainable income from the assets I'm building up. Right? And if I just reproduce that line in this space, it's going to look like that. So that's income from assets. So I've got this income plus this income. And the income from assets is sustainable long term, and the income from the natural resources is unsustainable. It's only temporary. Because the income from assets is sustainable long term, all of it I can spend on consumption. I don't have to save it. So, just to show what's going on here, but by year 21, my natural resource revenue is 0, right? But it doesn't matter because I've built up my assets to here, and the income from the assets is just enough to pay for my spending. In year 19, the income from my assets is almost here's my assets in year 19. Income's almost enough to pay for my spending. And so I can save nearly all the natural resource income. The only natural resource income I need to use for spending is this little bit here. Huh? In year 1, I've hardly built up any assets, so my sustainable income is very small. If this is what I want to spend sustainably forever, nearly all of that is going to have to be met from natural resource income. So my savings out of natural resource income is going to be much lower. It's going to be basically that. So what do we get out of this? We get that the final picture. If you haven't followed, don't worry, I'll be able to summarize it. If we look at the savings rate out of natural resources, natural resource revenue, savings rate's going to start, well, let's start it at about 30%. By the time it runs out, the savings rate will have risen to nearly 100%. And then we know more natural resource revenue. Okay. So, what are the key building blocks you need to hang on to? One is that with an unsustainable revenue stream, we want to stretch spending longer into the future than the revenues. In this simple picture I've shown, we're stretching it forever. Ever's a long time. You might want to stretch it another 20 years or something, but you're likely to, there's good reason to think you want to stretch. Huh? So that's one point. You do that by building assets, by using a substantial proportion of the revenues from natural resources to build assets. Once you've built your assets, they'll generate an income which is sustainable. So you've converted an unsustainable revenue stream into a sustainable revenue stream. This is a big difference between environmental sustainability and economic sustainability. Environmental sustainability, you want to keep doing the same thing. You're growing trees, you want to keep growing trees. Economic sustainability, it doesn't matter what economic activity you're doing as long as it's generating a revenue stream. The economic activity you start with, natural resources, is inherently unsustainable. And so you've got to do something that, gets you off the melting ice floe so that you're standing on something which has got a more solid foundation. And that means building assets which can productively generate a sustainable level of income. And then the final point is that in order to build those assets, yes, you've got to save, but as those assets build, they're generating revenues, which is sustainable. As you approach the end of your resource extraction, if you build these assets, the revenue from the assets is quite close to covering your overall spending needs. And so the revenues from natural resources should be devoted overwhelmingly to saving. So you should be working up towards very high savings rate. Conversely, early on, because you haven't built up any assets yet, in order to benefit from higher consumption out of natural resources, at least some of the revenues have got to go on consumption. So in the example I've given, you'd start with a savings rate of about 30% out of natural resources and gradually build up over the 20 years to 100%. Okay? So a rising savings rate out of natural resources. Sorry if that's a bit complicated. That's the savings story. It's complicated in detail, but the key points are not difficult. One is you've got to save quite a lot of this stuff in order for it to be sustainable. Saving means building up assets. We'll come to which assets later. The assets have to be chosen so that they generate some revenue. And then the final point is you want to enjoy this higher consumption now as well as later. And so it's okay now to spend some of the resource revenues. As you build up your assets, you'll need to do that less and less. And that's why you can afford to have a higher savings rate as your assets accumulate. So a rising savings. But a rising savings rate from quite a substantial initial base. I've written 30, it might be 50, something like that. It's not 10. If you have a very low savings rate, you never build your assets up. Yeah. Okay, so the last point on savings is that savings is not a matter of putting some money in a pot and saying, this is the savings pot out of oil revenues or something. It's a matter of looking at the overall fiscal position and saying, compared to what we were doing, we've now got more revenue. We've got $100 million more revenue than we used to have. And we're accumulating $30 million a year more assets net than we used to do. Right? So it's the overall fiscal position, not earmark money in some particular pot. You've got to look at the total fiscal position. The example I gave you of Ghana, where the country is putting $200 million in a pot, saying oil savings, but at the same time borrowing $2 billion, that's not saving. Right? The net position is you're borrowing $1.8 billion. Right? You net out the change in borrowing and the change in assets. Right? And it's not just assets saved abroad. It's investment, it's domestic investment, domestic public investment. So you've got to take the sum of the change in the government's assets and liabilities abroad and the change in its assets and liabilities at home. That's the change in the net fiscal position. And you then compare that to what the net resource revenues are. And that gives you the savings rate, the asset, how much you're actually, of your revenues, you're using for assets, not consumption. By savings, I should say, I mean the acquisition of assets of any type Could be building a factory, it could be building a road, it could be putting money abroad, it could be paying debt back. This is all improving the net asset position. Yeah? Because it's by improving your net asset position that you're going to be generating a bigger sustainable income. Yeah.
In your experience as an advisor to developing countries, how has this been a challenge? Because I am from the little basic data that I've seen, it has always been a challenge for developing countries to see.
So I've been asked to repeat the question so that we can hear it. So that the question is, basically, government's doing this. And the answer is usually not. Right? And we'll come to this with Danny on our panel this afternoon. Usually not. Right? If I had to point to one mistake in this whole decision chain, I'd say it's that one. With some honourable exceptions, you know. But now that the super cycle's over, you kind of need to be asking yourselves the question, what have you got to show for it that's sustainable? And too often the answer is not enough, you know, not enough. And so what's gone wrong is here. So that's the first step, save. Let's come to the next step, which is invest. And this is where the big difference between poor countries and rich countries really emerges. Because poor countries should do different things from rich countries at this stage. By invest, I mean, what assets do you acquire? So you save some money in the sense that we're not spending this on consumption. Now the question, what we're going to do with it? And the big choice is, do you put it abroad? Sovereign wealth fund? Do you invest it domestically? Better roads, better schools, whatever. More electricity generation or something like that. And the global role model on how to manage natural resources sustainably has been Norway. And Norway advises a lot of developing countries. About 50 governments have asked Norway for advice. And Norway has indeed been brilliantly run. Sustainable strategy, exactly this strategy of building up assets. But what makes a lot of sense for Norway in terms of choices of assets doesn't make much sense for poor countries. And the reason is that what Norway does is put its money abroad. It's got a huge sovereign wealth fund invested in Brazil and China and America and what have you, around the world. And it makes a lot of sense for Norway to do that, because by the time Norway started to do that, it was already very capital rich. That is, it already had a lot of public investment within Norway. In fact, I've checked the figures, and there were the the average Norwegian worker,
member of the labour force, had more,
capital invested, was working with more capital than any other country in the world. So the very high ratio of capital to labour in Norway. So adding even more capital investment in Norway wasn't going to be very productive. You know, every island off the coast of Norway had a bridge. So the 3 people living on, you know, Untafland had a bridge to themselves, and the 2 people living on the island beyond that had got a bridge for themselves. They'd run out of things to do that was sensible. Right? Now, they could have built bridges next to bridges or flyovers and fly-unders and, you know. But they decided very sensibly, we've had enough of that. Let's invest in China and Brazil where they're actually using, you know, they need capital, they can pay us a good return on it. And so that's what they did. That made a lot of sense. We're going to come to that here. So just wait, just hold, but it's a good question, right? So, just to summarize, it makes a lot of sense for Norway to do what Norway does, right? But if you come Sierra Leone or Guinea, you know, or Zambia or Timor-Leste or something, you're not Norway. In the sense that far from being awash with capital, you're desperately short of capital. There's been very, very little public investment for decades. And so deciding that the best thing to do is invest in Brazil rather than invest in Sierra Leone is really pretty odd. You know, it's really a counsel of despair. It's saying our country's hopeless, it's going to stay hopeless, let's invest in Brazil, you know. If that's what you really believe, then you might as well all get on a boat and go to Brazil. I mean, you know, the central task is to develop your country. And natural resource revenues give you the best chance you'll ever have to do that. They give you temporary revenues which need to be saved. And here's a country which can absorb the savings, which can potentially absorb the savings. So imitating Norway is not a sensible thing to do. It's what a lot of countries do. Just last month addressed the Association of Sovereign Wealth Funds in Africa. In about 3 weeks, I addressed the World Group of Sovereign Wealth Funds. Their investment managers on strategies. But the World Group said, go and address the Africans because it's the fastest growing part of the sovereign wealth fund industry. More African sovereign wealth funds have been set up in the last few years than anything else. But it's not a sensible strategy, you know. It's a strategy of imitation without understanding what's driving the decision. You know, it makes sense for Norway. It makes sense for Qatar or Kuwait, right? Places that are the size of a postage stamp that are already covered in concrete with
Elias palaces all over them.
they've no room to put anything sensibly in, you know.
But you're not that.
So, invest domestically is the next point. And now we come to your point, which is, well, before we invest domestically, hadn't we better ask why nobody else has? Why is our country so
short of capital.
After all, at the moment, the world's awash with capital. So is there something about our country that means that, yes, we're short of capital, but that doesn't mean that investment necessarily has a high return? Maybe we're short of capital because investment has a low return. And so the final stage is what I call investing in investing, building the capacity to invest productively. Building the capacity to invest productively. Basically, to invest well domestically, to do good investment projects. So let's talk about that a bit. And we start with public investment. Doing public investment well, right? And there's a very big difference between doing public investment well and doing it badly. You know? And you can probably all think of examples of both. We can break down the process of doing public investment into 4 steps. And the first step is designing possible projects. Right? So the government's going to have some revenue to invest. What should we do? Let's get a menu of possible projects. We could do this, we could do that, let's design them. And you can do that design well or badly. The next step, much harder. You can buy project design on the world market. But the next step is select your projects. That's, in the end, has to be a political decision. And the nightmare is that the president says, you know, I want a motorway to my village. Or the minister says, I think, you know, I've just been in America and in Silicon Valley they've got this, you know, this wonderful new technology. I think we should have a Silicon Valley here. Why don't we build a science park? And that sounds a good idea in the first minute. And then you start to think, is it really a good idea? You know? And if you never go beyond that first minute, you can spend millions of dollars creating something that's never going to work. You know? Just because the minister read a magazine on a plane or saw something out of the car windows. You know. In other words, the danger of project selection is with a lot of political influence with not enough technocratic input. Having designed and selected it, the next stage is you've actually got to implement it. You've got to build it. And that's where a lot of corruption can come in. You know, Danny's the expert there, but you know, how do you do the procurement? How do you monitor what is actually going on? How do you hold the contractor to account for actually delivering on the contract?
just thinking,
I've talked to 2 African finance ministers who've been telling me that their governments have bought stadiums that they daren't open because they're so badly built that they feel they'll fall down. So, the implementation wasn't properly monitored. And then the final stage is evaluation. Once you've done it, well or badly, do you have any capacity to think, what did we learn from doing that? Did it go well? Let's evaluate it. And if it went badly, what have we learned? You know? There was a very impressive event in Uganda a couple of years ago. Every year the president brings together 200 top public officials in the country for 3 days and basically holds them to account in front of their peers. And they've all got targets for the year, and they have to stand up at the end of the year in front of all the other 200 and say either, we did this, here's the evidence that we completed it, or we didn't, we failed. And if you failed, you're all right, as long as you've got a good story as to why. We failed because we didn't anticipate this, and this is the lessons we need to draw from it. Then you're all right. If you failed without good reason, that's not great. You're basically out. And that's evaluation linked to accountability, and pretty rapid accountability. It's no good doing these evaluations 10 years hence when everybody's gone. So rapid evaluation linked to accountability, and it's not just accountability, it's linked to learning. The link to learning is probably even more important than the link to accountability. All good organizations, smart people get things wrong. Getting things wrong is not a sign that you shouldn't have done it. The important step is the next step. Do you cover it up, or do you learn from it? Yeah.
This stage of, let me come back to you. I understand you may have taught many ministers or presidents in this world. The problem under the designing of the possible project, one of the things we find in our countries is where democracy plays a key role, the political system in the country. Because once they design a project and say this government selected or an ETS, a different government come out kind of put the project aside. And I think that has been...
Yes. So what's the best solution to that? My own sense is that project selection needs to be, if you like, as technocratic as possible. It needs to be kept at some distance from the senior politicians. There's quite a useful technique. It's not magic, but cost-benefit analysis, where you subject a project, you say, what's its cost, what's its benefits, how big are the benefits relative to the costs? And it's a very healthy thing to do, to subject all potential public projects to some standardized cost-benefit analysis, which is done by technocrats protected from political pressure. And it will still get things wrong. Cost-benefit analysis is not immaculate and foolproof, but it will guard against the really big mistakes, the really big failures. Yeah.
Investing in investment or investing. You assume that the system is there or a strategy is there for the investment to be made, where it doesn't exist. There's no consensus
Yeah.
internally.
We're going to come to that once we finish this session, is building the, I'll give you a preview, building the rules, the institutions, and the critical mass of citizen understanding that enables all this to be put in place. Because it's not in place, exactly. But the teaching strategy is first for you to see what needs to be done, and then in our final session, we move to, so politically, institutionally, how do you make that happen? Because it hasn't happened. Right? If I was describing something that was already functioning, why bother? Listen to something else, you know. What I'm describing is what ought to. Huh? And hopefully, as I've gone on, you've seen, yeah, why does this make sense? Why would my country be a better place if this happened? And then we come to the challenge of how, but it's not. Huh? So, what I've described to you is the first component of investing in investing. Probably the most important part. It's got these 4 steps. Project selection, project design, project selection, project implementation, and project evaluation. And there's fortunately, I mean, I should say, one of my roles, I had an advisory role with the IMF, and so they picked up this idea that investing was important. And so they built an index to measure each of these capacities for about 70 countries. So it's there as a public index. You can just Google it, and it's called the Public Investment Management Index. And if you just Google PIMI and IMF, a working paper will pop up, and if you scroll to the end of the working paper, there's all the information in detail for over 70 countries in the world. Each component scored on I think a 4 or 5 point scale. So you can just check for your country, what's it doing well, what's it doing not so well. I remember I had to do a lecture for the BCR, the Francophone Central Bank for West Africa, the 8 West African countries, and 6 of them were evaluated by this. And if you took the average score, they were pretty awful. But if you took the best from each of the 6 countries, so they're all different in their capacities, if you took the best from all 6 countries, you'd got, I think, the 5th rated country in the world. And so my message to them in West Africa was, you don't need to learn from Thailand or anything, just learn from each other. You're each doing different bits of this well, you know? So that's public investment. Now let me say that public investment is only one leg of investing in investing. Because public investment and private investment are complements. They work together. The public sector builds the roads, the private sector invests in the trucks. And roads without trucks, they're not very useful. And trucks without roads, they're even worse. You know, so they fit together. You want public investment in the roads, but yes, you want private investment in the trucks. And the government controls the public investment, they don't control the private investment. But it sets the policy environment in which private investment in trucks is either a good idea or a bad idea. And so investing in investing is also a matter of just make sure that your policy environment for private investment is conducive to private investment, you know? Not in the natural resource sector itself. This is in these sustainable investments like, you know, factories or whatever that go on years after the natural resources have been used up. There's one other leg of investing in investing I'll talk about, which is that both public investment and private investment often use the same sorts of inputs. For example, both public investment and private investment use cement. And in a lot of poor countries, cement is outrageously expensive. Does anybody know who the richest man in Africa is? How do you make his money? Cement. Yeah. He's a nice guy. I know him, and he said to me, until I think 2003, he didn't even make any cement. He just imported it. If you import it through a system where you end up basically importing it at $1 a bag and selling it at $3, and you do that often enough, you end up worth $10 billion. You know, but it wasn't his fault that cement was so expensive, but it was way above the world price. And so a final element of investing in investing is just bring down these, what economists call unit costs of capital goods. Try and make capital goods cheaper. Africa's got some of the most expensive capital goods in the world. Both cement for buildings and equipment. Because the equipment is often sold through monopoly distribution channels with very big markets in very small national markets. Regional integration is a good way of getting more competition in the distribution chains. Competition is pretty well always your friend in getting costs down. Okay, so that's the decision chain. In closing this section, just let's think for a little bit about sequencing. And in other words, what you do first, what you do next. Very simple point here. You don't want to put the cart before the horse, right? And the cart is investing, and the horse is investing in investing. You need to build the capacity to invest before you really scale up investing. Okay? Now, you can build the capacity to invest even before big resource revenues flow. It's never too soon to improve the capacity to invest, to do investing in investing. And until you've done it, it's dangerous to do big domestic investment. For exactly the reasons you were implying, I think. So if you've not done the investing in investing, and revenues start to arrive, you still need to save them. What would you then do with them? Well, the right answer is park them abroad until you've built the capacity to invest at home. And once you've built the capacity to invest at home, you bring it back. So there's actually two different reasons why you might want to save money abroad. One is riding the tiger, the ups and downs of commodity prices, and the other is just buy yourself some time to build the capacity to invest well domestically. If you park it abroad, it's not lost. If you invest badly, it's lost.
What about if your interest, let's say not developing countries, say in the UK, and they know that even if they park in their domestic account, like just in anything as such, it would be better than parking it abroad?
No, if you, for example, put it in the banks domestically, so the government puts it in the banks, it stayed within the country, then it's a question, what do the banks do with it, right? Well, the banks might themselves put it abroad, right? In which case it's gone abroad, or they might lend it out. If they lend it out, it depends what they lend it for. They might lend it to a load of people who want to consume. Yeah? Want to use their credit card, run their credit card debt up, right? In which case you've not even saved it. Yeah? The government saved it in the banks, but the banks have lent it to people who just accumulate debts, consumer debts. Yeah? So it very much depends. If you put it into the domestic financial system, that's only wise if the domestic financial system is able to use it well. Anybody from Kazakhstan? Eh? Neighbors, yeah. Well, you're rather different, though. But Kazakhstan was a pretty disastrous story where the government, actually the government did save, it actually saved abroad. But the private banks, the commercial banks, then went to the international banks and said, look, the government's got big money abroad, so that's effectively collateral for us. So it was. So the international banks, who of course been very wise the last few years, lent a heap of it to the banks of Kazakhstan. Well, there wasn't much to invest in Kazakhstan, except housing. So there was a huge property boom, the sort of property boom that makes America and Britain's property boom look like chicken feed. And it went the way of all property booms, which is bust, right? In which case the Kazakh banks went bust. And what was behind the Kazakh banks, but the Kazakh government, so all the money that it saved abroad was brought back to bail out its banks. So this is a story in which basically the private sector, the government was prudent, but it had a very imprudent private banking sector which it didn't regulate well enough. Yeah? So that's an important story because it's not just governments that can mess up. Right? As we really know from the global financial crisis, governments do not hold a monopoly of folly. Right? And so, one role for a good government is to regulate the banking system to make sure that folly is contained. So that's a very long answer to your story, but the implication of it is, unless you can really trust your domestic financial system, which you probably on, it's better to save abroad directly.
While we're looking at the chart on the investment, just to take us a little bit backwards, we all agree that investments on assets is a little bit more sustainable, or rather sustainable, particularly when the government has been able to identify the level of investment or income that you're getting from assets. Now, my question is this: what's the disadvantage in putting back into investment income from assets, 100% anyway, 100% of income from assets, and 100% of income from the natural resource?
Okay. Yeah. So, as it were, this is a minimum for sustainability. Your point is, if you want this economy to grow, you could go further than that. You could say, well, sure, this income's sustainable, but let's actually build so that we get our curves going upwards, sloping upwards, not flat. Very sensible, you know. Learn from China. I mean, China's revenues were not natural resource revenues. You know, it's not a natural resource economy. But it's had a savings rate of around 50%. I mean, I think that's crazy myself, but that's what they've been doing. And as a result, they've been growing very fast. So it's a huge sacrifice of the present, living standards in the present, but it's certainly building a future that people can look forward to. And I think that's absolutely right, that for a poor economy, you want to, what people most want, even more than jam today, is the prospect that their children will grow up in a more prosperous environment. And you can only do that if you have higher saving and investment rates, certainly than Africa's had in the past. But natural resources are the big opportunity to get these savings rates up. Once you've got them up, you might decide, well, actually, let's keep them up. But yeah. Okay, so we've done the full sequence. You discover your resources. You design a tax system that is robust to the sort of shocks you can anticipate, like price changes, and a tax system which overcomes the problems of asymmetric information and agency. You deal properly with the local so that environmental damage is minimized and compensated, and there's some local spillover benefits that are economic spillover benefits. Right? You build a volatility fund which enables you to ride the tiger in commodity prices, and you use a growing share of revenues from natural resources to build a future. You build a future not only by saving, but by investing domestically. And that domestic investment is done well because you've built the capacity to do it well. Yeah? So that's the story in a nutshell. Now we draw a big line under that, and we turn to the question that's been bothering a number of you, very sensibly, is that's all very well, but it isn't happening in my country. And so now we're going to look at what politically is involved in getting all this to happen. And I'm going to give you 4 layers of, 4 components of a solution. And just to give you the headings, you might as well write them down. So we're looking at political solutions. Rules. Rules, institutions, a critical mass of citizens, and an authorizing environment. And now we're going to work through those. Say what we mean by them. Rules. What do rules do? They do 3 things, really. Firstly, they provide guidance for decision takers. So some decisions are going to have to be taken again and again over the whole 20 years or whatever it is that you've got natural resources. And it's sensible for successive decision takers to follow the same decision path, and that means having a rule. So rules coordinate both over time and over space. If it's a decentralized process so that several people are taking the decision, you might have decentralized some of your revenues to local governments. But you might want them subject to the same basic rule of guidance. So they just guide decision takers as to, here's this decision, it's happened before, here's what I'm supposed to do. Right? So the rule is guidance. Next thing that a rule does is suppose a decision taker decides not to follow the rule. Well, then it becomes news. There may be a very good reason not to follow the rule. In this particular situation, there's some circumstances that the rule didn't envisage, and so it doesn't make sense to follow it. All things. Rules are set for the typical, not for always and everywhere. But if you've got a rule and the decision taker decides not to follow it, they have to explain why. Because breaking the rule creates a signal, it creates news. And the very thought that, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to explain, shall I follow this rule, shall I not? Well, the fact that you're actually going to have to justify your decision if you break it itself is is it's a mild incentive to actually follow the rule. And the final advantage of a rule is that they basically take discretion off politicians to yield to pressures of the moment. And I have to say, often politicians themselves favor rules for that reason. Because often politicians know that, they're subject to pressure that if only they could find a reason to say no, they would stand up to the pressure. But if the people pressing know that there's nothing between them and a decision in their favor, there's nothing impeding it other than the minister's choice, the minister finds it very difficult to say no. And so having a rule, I've been friends with a lot of central bank governors. And I won't say which country this story came from, but the committee of the Senate, Finance Committee of the Senate came to see him and said, explain what his policy was. And he said, oh, yeah, what you're doing is fine for the country, but it's not good for us. They were pretty honest in their dishonesty. He said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. Tell me, gentlemen, what I can do for you. And so they came and said to him, you're going to build regional branches. He said, yes, I'm going to build regional branches. We'll bring the contractors for you. So he said, oh, thank you, gentlemen, very much. That'd be really helpful, but don't forget that the government's now introduced new competitive tendering rules, so they better be good. They were furious, but that was where he could just turn to a rule and say, not my doing, gentlemen. Here's this rule, and I have to obey it. And so rules actually help. They even help politicians who'd like to do the right thing, but a lot of politicians in your countries come to power with debts to others. That's the big stumbling block. And it's trying to give them, quite often the politicians themselves are decent, but they're in debt to people who are not. And so giving them some devices for protecting themselves against these pressures of accumulated political obligation is a very helpful thing to do. Yeah, so that's a good point. The ministers are often technocrats, but they're subject to political party pressure, which is sort of ideological. And so again, having some rules to fall back on is just handy defense, Let's give you some examples of rules that would be distinctive but useful in the sphere of natural resources. And if you think through the day so far, you'll be able to think of some. But here's one, competition in extraction rights. Trying to have a rule which says whatever the extraction rights we're selling are, they must be sold through a competitive process. Not first come, first served, Danny's going to talk about transparency in revenues and in contract processes. They can also be rules. The savings rates. Savings rates out of natural resources. Ghana actually legislated a savings rate out of natural resources, at least 30%. It was sensible for the legislator to have a rule. And the weakness was that they didn't define it in terms of the overall net asset position of the government. It was money put in a pot. A year ago, I addressed the two economic committees of Ghana's parliament. And as soon as I point to them and said, you borrowed 2 billion and put 200 billion in a pot you've not saved, they saw the point. As soon as that was on the table, they saw the point. So it was sensible to have a savings rule. It just needed to be specified better as to what savings really was. Investing in investing, all those procedures. One rule I'd like to see is that for all public investment projects, there's an independent cost-benefit analysis done before you do the selection. Botswana, one of the reasons it grew so fast was that they had a policy rule which said that, and then it said if it doesn't return, I think it was 8%, we won't do it. We'll do all the projects that yield 8% as long as we've got enough money, 8% or more, but if it doesn't yield 8%, we're not doing it. We'll put the money abroad. And Botswana being a small, near desert, landlocked, there weren't that many things that yielded 8%, so they've accumulated about $7 billion abroad in a fund. So for them, it was sensible to do a Norway because, unlike most countries, they didn't have that many domestic investment opportunities. Rules on good project implementation. And I described you the rule that Rwanda has on project evaluation. Stand up and defend yourself, Evaluation linked to accountability. Pretty good policy rule, that. When is a rule? It doesn't have to be legislated. That's the sort of Rolls-Royce of rules. But you can also have things that are just announced publicly. This is the policy that this ministry is going to do. It has to be public, otherwise it's not a rule, I think. If it's just a practice that civil servants share amongst themselves, they're free to change it with no consequence. And so it's got to have that public dimension to it, to be a rule. So that's rules. And let's turn to institutions. Rules and institutions are often muddled up in the literature. People use institutions, in fact, one famous phrase is, institutions are the rules of the game. No, rules are the rules of the game. Right? Institutions are what are institutions? They're teams of people with a mandate and the capacity to do a certain task, often to implement a rule. So they're teams with a task, and you can start by saying, let's have a look at the mission statement. Does the mission statement adequately capture the task? You know? Is the legal mandate appropriate for the task that's been set? So has the team got the authority to do what is needed to accomplish this task? Is it equipped with the capacity to do it? Does it have the human resources? Does it have the physical resources? You know, how many units in government can you think of where, you know, there's a few people in an office with no functioning computers, and, you know, it's just a label on a door. It's not a functioning team. So, why do you need institutions? Well, partly they are clusters of capacity to implement these rules. Yeah?
The system of state capture, where the executive more or less represents the institutions, who sees where is determined by the political committee.
Let me wait till, say that again when we get to the critical mass of citizens, right? And the reason why institutions are particularly important is that a lot of this stuff that we've been through is to an extent complex. Right? It's not dead simple. And so you need institutions that can handle complexity, that build the specialist capacity, that have different people specialized in different things within the team. Handling complexity requires teams within which you've got specialization, and overall you've invested in a lot of capacity, and it builds expertise, builds experience. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. One is running auctions. If you're going to run auctions for natural resources, you need a mandated team. You need an institution that is going to handle that within the Ministry of Natural Resources, probably. You'll need a team that builds expertise, that builds relationships with reputable natural resource companies, that gradually, persuades them to take the country seriously, come and look. You'll need a team that manages the public geological information. And you'll certainly need a team that manages any volatility fund, any money that you park abroad. That has to be managed. Now, you can think of rules and institutions together as a form of checks and balances on each other, so that you can, some institutions can be checks on others, and some rules can check some institutions. And it's very important to build a system of effective checks and balances. I've done some statistical work on this, and we've looked to see whether countries with natural resources perform better if they're democracies? And the basic answer is the key aspect of democracy that matters is not electoral competition, is checks and balances. Electoral competition by itself actually seems to make policy worse. You think of the very tightly fought elections in Ghana and Zambia as each government, each party being pushed to the edge of how much can we promise, you know? So electoral competition alone doesn't seem to build good management of natural resources, but checks and balances do. In fact, to an extent, we can sort of quantify this and say that resource-rich countries need unusually strong checks and balances. They need stronger checks and balances than countries without natural resources. If they get sufficiently strong checks and balances, they grow more rapidly than countries without natural resources. So that's the potential. If you've got strong checks and balances, you can harness these natural resources for good. But here's the killer. Do countries with natural resources have stronger checks and balances than other countries? No, the opposite. They have weaker. And you can even see it as a process over time. That natural resources, when countries get natural resources, that tends to undermine, to weaken checks and balances. I suppose there's so much money in the system, what keeps crooks from the money is the checks and balances, and so they attack the checks and balances. The checks and balances are in the way, so they get weakened, they get undermined. Your job is in part to push back on that. As I say, there's a lot of the future left, and what you need to be doing is building, putting in place the checks and balances, the institutions and the rules that enable these natural resources to be harnessed and that whole decision chain to be implemented. Yeah? Can I just press something? Okay, so we've done rules, we've done institutions. I just want to run through all this, and then we've finished, and then we have a little talk. Critical mass of citizens. I should have said informed citizens. Right? Without a critical mass of informed citizens, the rules and the institutions are just, the rules are just words on paper, the institutions are just labels on doors. So building a critical mass is absolutely vital. Let me give you an example which has nothing to do with natural resources, of the power of a critical mass of citizen understanding. And we're not going to look at poor little countries that are struggling. We're going to look at fine, big, strong European countries that we all know are wonderfully governed, right? And we're going to see how the power of a critical mass of citizens really matters. Yeah? And we're going to take first, we'll take two rules and one institution that were introduced in the year 2000 for the Eurozone. The institution is the European Central Bank, and the rules were rules about fiscal deficits and debt. In fact, we can just take the rule about fiscal deficits on its own. So, the rule came in the year 2000. All these fine, well-governed European countries, 15 years they've had of that rule. There are 17 countries. How many of those 17 countries have followed that fiscal rule for the last 15 years? Which they all agreed to. Not none. One. Which country? No. No, Germany broke it. Germany broke it. Yeah. There's only one. It's Finland. It's why the Finns are so cross. And if you read anything about Finnish politics, they're really, really deeply angry. With some justification, right? You know, when 16 others break the rule, the Finns are either very, very good or, you know, rather silly. But yeah, 16 of them have broken it, right? So here we've got an environment where everybody's supposed to be, you know, rules are rules and institutions are institutions. And nobody gave a damn. Right? Why? Because there was no attempt to build citizen understanding across the Eurozone as to what the Eurozone rules were. None. None. Why should any national government bother to say, we signed up to this system and it means we, this government, have got to obey these rules from Brussels? Brussels didn't do it. Brussels couldn't communicate out of, you know, couldn't get itself out of a paper bag, let alone communicate with European citizens. So no communication, no critical mass of citizens. Rule ignored. Not just once, but spectacular. The European Commission brought all the finance ministers to Brussels to do a reset once it became apparent that they'd all ignored it. So about 5 years ago, they all stood there, all the finance ministers, Thursday afternoon in Brussels. They stand up in a line and say, from now on, we're going to follow this fiscal rule. That was Thursday afternoon. Friday morning in Madrid, the Spanish finance minister said, oh, it doesn't apply to us, of course. Because the Spanish population was pleased to hear that. There was no critical mass saying, but this is a rule we've got to follow, you know. On the contrary, he just said, you know, we're Spain, we're not listening to these idiots in Brussels, you know. So there's an example of a complete failure to build a critical mass in countries very used to rules and institutions, and the rules and institutions totally fail. Okay? And then a rule and institution which have worked astoundingly well, and that's inflation in Germany. Astonishingly, even now, survey evidence from German citizens listing what's the worst thing that could possibly happen to you rates inflation above cancer. So deeply ingrained in the German psyche is aversion to inflation. Right? And that is why Germany, the institution and the rule, there's a budget balance rule, there's an institution, the independent central bank, and that's why the rule and the institution work in Germany, because it's backstopped by a critical mass of citizen understanding. How did Germany get this critical mass of citizen understanding? I love giving this little lecture in Germany because I get to this point and I say, so, you know, which is the best run country in Europe? And they all smile and say, Germany, and that's right. And then I say, why is Germany the best run country in Europe? And you can see all the bubbles going up above people's heads saying, because we're German. And, and then I give them the right answer. You are the best run country in Europe because you used to be the worst. And the German genius, which is a very useful genius to have, is to learn from failure. Right? Germany went into hyperinflation, and they learned from it. Right? Argentina's been into hyperinflation. They've not learned from it. Right? Crisis is an opportunity to learn, but the learning is optional. You know? And that's your opportunity. You've all lived in countries that are, most of you at least, are living in countries that have missed big natural resource opportunities. That's the opportunity to learn. Right? The slogan you should be going back and spreading is never again. You know? So, building a critical mass of citizens technically, how is it done? Consistent message across government. People learn from narratives, that is, stories about struggle, rather than from technical information. You can just about digest what I've said today, but don't expect, that's not how to build a critical mass of citizens. You build a critical mass of citizens through good narrative stories. Okay? Leadership. Leaders need to walk the talk. Good examples of leaders, Nyerere in Tanzania, Mandela in South Africa, Meles in Ethiopia, they walk the talk. I knew Meles, and he lived very, very simply. And so it was possible for him, because he lived very simply, to build a public sector culture of parsimony and honesty.